Tonight we won't sit among royal guests or peer through lace veils at some grand cathedral. Instead, we'll slip quietly into a smaller room, a parlor lit by lamplight and the shimmer of satin gloves where love is negotiated in whispers rather than vows. Here, affection isn't declared, it's folded into gestures. A handkerchief smoothed once more than necessary. A question asked just loud enough for a chaperone to pretend she didn't hear. The wallpaper listens better than anyone, and even the sofa seems to measure the distance between two futures. Outside, a carriage waits under gaslight, its breath rising like a sigh. Inside, the air smells faintly of tea, paper, and nerves an alphabet of anticipation. In this world, love must be written before it is felt, witnessed before it is believed, and signed before it is spoken aloud. So lower the lights and let the hush of the parlor settle around you. If the quiet feels kind tonight, stay for a while. And if soft histories like this one keep you company, just breathe once, slowly. That's already enough to be part of it. Because stories like this don't begin with fireworks or fanfare. They begin with manners, with pauses, with the measured distance between two chairs in a well-behaved room. Before the vows, before the white dress or the music, love was an exercise in restraint choreography written in etiquette manuals of the age. To court someone in the Victorian world was to learn a new language made of glances, calling cards, and careful silences. Each movement had a rule. Every emotion, a ritual. So let's begin there, where romance was supervised, affection wore gloves, and the heart learned to wait its turn. The parlor is quiet enough to hear the scratch of a pen and the sigh of upholstery when someone shifts a little too far toward the middle cushion. A chaperone sits nearby, pretending to read a devotional, and the clock counts conversation in polite intervals. Across the carpet, two people are learning how to speak without saying anything forbidden. Every word is wrapped in lace and hesitation. A visit like this could last 20 minutes or change the course of a family's history. Courtship in the Victorian age was a performance of composure, gloved hands, steady posture, and carefully measured curiosity. Even affection needed supervision. The sofa was not just furniture, it was a boundary, an instrument of manners, and sometimes the quietest battlefield in London. Calling cards arrive like snow. Each card carries a name, an address, and a hope, and sometimes a small pencil note that says, "At home Thursday, 4 to 6. It is a schedule written in code, the code being that everyone knows what it means. The door opens, a hat is lifted. An umbrella is placed with reverence in a brass stand that feels older than weather. A respectable caller sits, not too near and not too far, and asks after the health of relatives whose names have been collected like pressed flowers in earlier visits. Everything has a right distance. This is a culture that measures inches with its eyes. The sofa is exactly as long as a conversation should be. The teacup is exactly as deep as a pause. There is a chaperone, which is a polite word for human speed bump. She sits and smiles and polishes sentences until they are perfectly dull. The pair under light inspection talk about books as if the books might faint. They return volumes carefully, on time, with notes as pale as fog slipped between pages. No one says, "I like you." Instead they say, "I found the last chapter surprisingly instructive," which means the same thing, but travels through the air more slowly. Gossip moves faster than affection, so the etiquette is designed like a sieve, letting friendly water through and catching anything with flavor. Neighbors compare who left at past and who left at 20 before, as if minutes were clues. The good chaperone pretends not to hear the clock, which is an advanced skill. Eventually, there is a small promise, and it takes the shape of a locket with hair inside, or a miniature photograph tucked into a case, or a ring that knows it may be joined later by a more elaborate successor when means improve. Engagement is not fireworks, it is a list. The list begins in a drawer. Linen first, then nightwear, then small sewing, then shoes. The list grows a room if it is well fed. Respectability likes to be fed with neat handwriting. Notices appear in newspapers between lost dogs and lectures, the way important things hide among the ordinary, so the ordinary will keep them secret. A family with an ink bottle lets the town know that two names are being moved into the same future. Practical calendars, clerical timetables, and the train schedule choose the date together. Superstition is invited but occupies no chair. By now the sofa has seen enough to retire. It yields the story to fabric. In early years, brides wear their best dress, which might be dove gray or leaf brown, or a deep blue remembered by the oldest aunt as serviceable. Then a queen chooses white, and suddenly history acquires laundry. White, said carefully, is not purity in a sermon. In a shop it is prosperity with a receipt. It is lace finding paper in the budget. It is a bodice that fits because someone with good eyes and pins made it tell the truth. Trains are short enough to be kind to staircases. Gloves are patient. A veil frames the face, so the photographs will age politely, which is to say, with minimal surprises. A simple band circles the ceremony and waits, modestly metal, to be joined later by a ring that has more to say. Fabric whispers often have understudies. Flowers stand in the wings with a vocabulary that Victorians enjoy as if the whole garden were a dictionary. Orange blossom suggests fertility because citrus trees do not mind repeating themselves. Myrtle speaks of lasting love in a tone the vicar will approve. A streak of blue lives somewhere small, like a secret that wants to be discovered but not debated. Bouquet size respects hands, doors, and the necessity of gesturing to relatives at key moments. Buttonholes hold a small echo of the bride's spray, which means the groom and his men carry a polite borrowing. If anyone forgets the meanings, no one is punished. The effort is the meaning. It is a quiet puzzle in which every correct answer is, "That looks nice." Tailors and dressmakers know they are building sentences. The morning coat, the waistcoat, the tie, subject, verb, object, everything must read well at a glance. You could run a finger along the seam and feel grammar. A seamstress's chalk lines are punctuation, and a well-set hem is a period with weight. Even the shoes make a gentle parenthesis as they enter the church porch and consider the weather. The whole outfit is designed for a photograph that may or may not occur on the day itself, which is one of the charming absurdities of the era. Photographs like light. Churches like shadow. Photographs ask people to be still. Churches ask people to walk. It is difficult to do both simultaneously unless you are a statue, and statues rarely accept invitations. The ceremony's order is old enough to have elbow patches. Banns are called in Anglican churches, or a license is procured with solemn authority. The processional remembers the Book of Common Prayer. Names are pronounced with careful sobriety because the register hears every syllable and will outlive the flowers. Seating is arranged for visibility rather than drama. Those who matter see. Those who claim to matter rely on their hats. The music is sometimes a small choir and sometimes a nimble cousin with a talent for hymn tempo, which is similar to the talent for carrying soup without spilling. Speeches may occur later, which keeps the service mercifully short. The important part is not the performance. It is the signature where ink performs its quiet miracle of turning two people into a legal sentence. A curious thing happens with pictures. Because exposure times are as long as a polite conversation about weather, many wedding photos are taken not at the wedding, but after in the controlled ecosystem of a studio. The couple returns, possibly 2 days later, and stands very still with the help of a discreet brace hidden behind the chair. The bouquet is chosen for its endurance, not its opinion. Backgrounds are painted to look slightly more real than reality. A photographer straightens a cuff the way a librarian straightens a book. The resulting cartes de visite and cabinet cards are slipped into albums that make the event page-shaped. On the reverse, someone writes a caption with the precision of a shipping label. Names, date, parish. The camera keeps the faces. The pen keeps the context. Outside the church, rice is sometimes thrown as small agricultural wish cast in the air. If rice is expensive, paper can stand in confetti shaped like confetti, which is confetti's only role. The couple enters a carriage. A satin shoe may be tied to the back as if the shoe had become an honorary guest who hates walking. Well-wishers scribble notes that sound like naval signals. Fair winds, safe harbor, right soon. The bells make one final statement and then retire for the afternoon. The streets around the church adjust their traffic the way streams adjust around stones. Everyone goes somewhere in small groups. The married go to breakfast. The phrase wedding breakfast is a kind joke because the meal occurs closer to noon than to dawn. But it is accurate in spirit. It is the first meal consumed by the couple in the state of being married. Therefore, it is breakfast by definition. Tea is poured with an intention that would embarrass a ceremony. Wine appears in moderation because speeches are planned and coherence is a shared goal. The food is practical, favorable to small bites, friendly to gloves, and generous enough that photographs later capture slightly happier cheeks. The top layer of the cake considers posterity and sometimes chooses it. It may be saved for christenings or anniversaries and wrapped like a winter story to be opened in more forgiving weather. Everyone who has ever doubted fruitcake quietly eats a second slice. Gifts are arranged on a side table so long it could host a modest anthology. A ledger keeps track of who gave what and which thank you note has just started its slow migration toward the post. Stationery acts as a second bouquet and will be caught by no one. Later, when the house is quiet, the couple will write neat notes with phrases as polished as doorknobs. Even gratitude is a ritual, and it prefers to be spelled correctly. If a silver toast rack appears, no one asks whether there will be enough toast to justify such architecture. The toast rack exists because a catalog existed. And the catalog existed because breakfast, apparently, required engineering. After the plates are stacked and conversations fold like napkins, the couple leaves. The leaving is its own small play. A route is chosen that may include cousins strategically placed like mile markers. Tickets go into a pocketbook with the confidence of experienced tickets. Trunks are labeled as if they were students beginning school. A railway carriage accepts them the way an uncle accepts a story he has heard before, but is willing to hear again. Honeymoons are sometimes stays with family, and sometimes modest journeys that feel larger because the world now remarks upon them in the plural. Wherever they go, they carry the first paragraph of a new ledger. From time to time, a custom tries to sneak in with too much color. Superstition wants to boss the schedule. The Victorians respond with a polite cough and a timetable. Dates are chosen by parents and clerics and train connections, not by the rumor that a certain Friday is sour. Love does not need luck when it has a registrar. Still small talismans find work. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. This is not law, but it is good conversation. A borrowed handkerchief performs better than a borrowed relative. The blue ribbon hides where it is comfortable. It is enough for the wearer to know. Secrecy is part of the charm's payload. Even the humbler elements have thought behind them. Gloves are less an accessory than a contract with the air. We will not leave fingerprints on the day. Umbrellas at the church door stand ready. Democracy in mahogany. If the sky cries, brides and grooms bloom under shared canopies, and the photographs look as if weather were applauding. The parish register receives the final signatures with a flourish that is not truly a flourish. It is the natural curvature of the new name at its first brave appearance. Witnesses sign as well, and some of them press a bit too hard, as if putting weight on truth would help it settle. Meanwhile, neighbors monitor hats. A tall hat observes other tall hats, the way lighthouses contemplate each other across a bay. Veils drift like patient clouds. Small boys examine boutonnieres with botanical seriousness. Very small girls stare at the cake as if it might ring a bell when the correct slice is cut. Everyone believes that they are keeping the day running by standing where the ushers told them. They are not wrong. A wedding is a machine powered by people who believe in seating plans. That is its gentle secret. It needs no heroics. It needs only punctuality, pens that cooperate, and shoes that refrain from making announcements. Later that evening, the house grows quiet in a way that remembers noise fondly. Confetti is swept with a decisive broom, which is the only decisive object allowed in the story. Carriage tracks fade from the dust road like thoughts that have concluded. On mantelpieces, cards stand in careful ranks. Someone remembers to unpin the myrtle and press it between pages. Someone else discovers rice in an unlikely pocket 3 days later and declares the find a sign of good fortune, which it is because it becomes a story to tell at future breakfasts. Albums close. The bell that chimed the hour returns to whatever hours do when they are not being chimed. There is, in all this, an oddly comforting bureaucracy. Affection is witnessed by forms. Memory is helped by captions. Feelings are translated into fabric and flower and a page in a book. Even the old sofa shoulders some of the credit, having done the early, silent work of seating two people just far enough apart that they could imagine the space between them, and then reduce it appointment by appointment. Weddings here are not adventures. They are routines practiced with sincerity until the routine itself is beautiful. A person falling asleep might find this restful because it promises that order and tenderness can coexist like two names written with the same pen. And so the day recedes, as all days do, into the neatness that paperwork loves. The trousseau list is folded at the back of a drawer like a satisfied blueprint. The bouquet becomes a keepsake or a story, depending on how well it dries. Rings discover that circles do not end, which is ideal for rings. Perhaps the couple will write the first of many notes later that night, beginning, "Thank you for the warming pan." We look forward to a winter in a hand that leans lightly forward, as if walking toward tomorrow. Perhaps they will simply sleep, and the ledger will wait. In the hush after bells and breakfast with the last rice grain rescued from a shoe, the Victorian wedding becomes exactly what it wanted to be. A day so well arranged that it keeps breathing softly in the albums long after the people in it have moved on to new. Paragraphs and new breakfasts and more paper and more pens, everything continuing in tidy lines like rest. You might not expect lace to have a work ethic, but in the Victorian parlor it certainly did. It whispered across cuffs and collars like a diligent clerk, filing feelings into categories. Cordial, hopeful, possibly promising with supervision. The sofa supervised too. Its distance was a unit of measure, more accurate than inches. Couples sat where upholstery told them to sit. A chaperone hovered like a pleasant cloud that occasionally rained small talk, and the clock ticked in a tone that suggested it had seen many romances and found them orderly. If you're still awake by the time I begin describing the stitching on glove buttons, and I will feel free to subscribe, but please don't strain. Drowsy support is the only kind required here. In those supervised rooms, conversation was performed with the care of embroidery. Topics were chosen for their safe edges. A book recently returned, a cousin who plays the pianoforte with heroic restraint, a walk in the park where the ducks were admired but not addressed. People visited at-home hours listed on calling cards, each card a small passport granting 20 minutes of flawlessly moderate opinion. Handwritten notes wrote on the back like visas. Thursday 4 to 6, which translated in the dialect of doilies to "there will be cake, but no decisions." The chaperone practiced the ancient art of gentle obstruction, never saying no, only adjusting the sofa by one cushion. No one confessed, exactly. They complimented the weather in ways that clearly meant each other. Letters were written in legible ink, with margins straight enough to reassure any parent passing the desk. Books were lent and returned without fingerprints. Romance was a library system, and overdue fines were paid in blushes. An engagement arrived with little sound, like fog deciding to settle. Sometimes it was a hair locket, a miniature oval where a wisp of personhood slept behind glass. Sometimes a photograph hid in a velvet case as if practicing for the wedding album that would eventually collect it. Rings appeared modestly at first, as if rings understood installment plans. A notice ran in the local paper between a lost spaniel and an advertisement for reliable liniment. In print, the two families tried on the future and found it fit. The trousseau became a list, and the list became a drawer, and the drawer argued persuasively for a room. Linen multiplied the way good intentions do. Nightwear was discussed in a tone so delicate it nearly evaporated. A needle stitched through afternoons, making a sound like the smallest possible decision. Dates were chosen by the only authorities that truly mattered: parents, clergy, and the railway timetable. Friday superstition knocked, but was asked to wait in the hall. Clothing prepared itself as if for a public reading. Early brides wore their best-dressed navy or dove, perhaps a polite brown that claimed to go with everything in life. Then Victoria stepped into white, and the notion that a dress might resemble a fresh page in a ledger became fashionable. White meant many things to many shopkeepers: light, laundry, possibility, sales. It also meant that stitches had to be perfect, because white reports everything to the eye like a helpful tattletale. Honiton or Brussels lace settled on sleeves that behaved themselves. The bodice took charge of posture. Veils framed the face so time would soften them evenly in photographs. Gloves buttoned up like excellent arguments. Shoes understood that they must walk with dignity on gravel and tile, and the complicated surfaces of opinion. Flowers spoke in sentences that botanists would not endorse, but Victorians loved. Orange blossom promised futures as steadily as a ledger's straight line. Myrtle offered loyalty with the steadiness of bookkeeping. A hint of blue somewhere, a ribbon hem. Garter stood for fidelity, and occasionally for the practical fact that someone owned blue thread. Bouquets considered scale. They had to pass through doorways, sit without wilting in a lap during the serious part of the service, and still look photogenic several hours later if the studio appointment was scheduled after the wedding breakfast, as so many were. Boutonnieres echoed the bouquet like a well-behaved footnote. If you forgot the formal language of flowers, you could still get the joke. Everything meant well, and meaning well was half the tradition. The groom dressed as grammar. Morning coat, capital letter, waistcoat, verb, tie, conjunction. Shoes quietly demonstrated parallel structure. A best man kept the rings and the schedule and the smaller panics in his pockets. Bridesmaids marked the aisle not as decoration, but as supportive punctuation commas that kept the sentence from running on too breathlessly. Widows and aunts took pride of place and practiced the face that says, "I approve," which is a different face from "I am interested," hats assembled like diplomatic corps, observing one another across pews. If the weather was uncertain, umbrellas waited by the church porch like a team of substitute players who longed to demonstrate their usefulness. Inside, the order of service flowed in an architecture of sentences practiced for centuries. Bands had been called, or licenses procured with stamps and signatures that smelled faintly of iron gall ink. The procession knew its route the way a needle knows cloth. Vows were spoken aloud, which is to say, into the future's ear. The register waited at the end like a finish line made of paper. Names were written legibly because the book had ambitions to live longer than anyone present. If a hand shook, it was the quill's fault, never the person's. Music existed to accompany, not announce, a small choir, a confident cousin at the harmonium, a hymn that everybody almost knew. Speeches were postponed until later when the acoustics would be friendlier and cake would mediate meaning. Photography, meanwhile, cooperated on its own schedule. Cameras of the era were enormous boxes that ate light slowly and digested it into images with the seriousness of a courthouse. The studio promised controlled weather and a background that looked like a plausible library, which every respectable image deserved. On the day itself, a photographer might attempt a hurried outdoor portrait of the couple, who stood as still as furniture while their relatives pretended to be trees. More often, the appointments happened afterward, 2 days later, or next Thursday, when the bride's hem had relaxed from its interactions with gravel, and the groom's caller had decided not to argue anymore. A discreet iron support hid behind a chair to help the human body understand long minutes. Bouquets were chosen for stamina. The photographer adjusted cuffs with the commitment of a tailor and then reminded everyone to breathe but not move, which is a kind of magic trick. The resulting cards were slid into albums that turned events into objects. On their backs, captions carried the crucial metadata: names, parish, date, and the family handwriting that future genealogists would study like a weather map. Outside, small rituals did busy, friendly work. Rice, the grain that thinks in seeds, flew like tiny wishes. When rice was dear, confetti deputized for it paper, pretending to be celebration, which is what paper does best. A satin shoe might be tied to the carriage, not because anyone believed a shoe could bless the journey, but because the shoe had at one time blessed walking and was now promoted. The couple waved, the door shut, and bells offered an opinion everyone enjoyed. People dispersed along neat pathways, as if the churchyard itself had printed instructions. Gifts retreated to a side table under the eye of an ant with a ledger. This ledger was the true social engine: item, giver, date, and a little check mark when the thank you note left the house. Gratitude moved at the speed of a good pen. The wedding breakfast, a phrase that keeps its own joke in its pocket, occurred around midday, which is a comfortable time to eat while pretending you are only beginning. Tables were set with china that minded its manners. Tea arrived in waves, supported by milk described as a drop, which could mean almost anything. Wine appeared in measured amounts, so toasts would be profound but navigable. Courses were designed to be fork-friendly. Sauces kept to the areas assigned. If speeches rose, they did so like hot air balloons, drifting genially over the landscape and landing safely before anyone noticed the clock. The cake had tiers like a social hierarchy, the lower levels for present hunger, the top one packed away like a time capsule for a christening or a first anniversary. It would be wrapped and stored with the seriousness once reserved for treaties. Fruitcake has the admirable diplomatic quality of surviving winters and opinions. Between courses, someone adjusted a bouquet caught in a vase that was almost but not quite large enough. This is what tradition feels like up close. Somewhere else, an uncle explained railway timetables as if they were literature. Children inspected place cards with the zeal normally reserved for butterflies. The couple performed the small duties of new sovereignty, thinking, smiling, eating enough to stand up later, and their chairs learned the curve of their backs. When awkwardness threatened, the silver toast rack stepped in like a conversational prop. It existed to remind everyone that breakfast can require architecture and that English ingenuity reaches its full bloom at the dining table. Departures were plays with short scripts and many stagehands. Trunks stood at attention, labels crisp as new banknotes. Tickets slept in a leather case, waking only when asked to prove themselves. The first journey might be short, to a sister's spare room, to a quiet seaside town with chairs for looking at gulls, to a modest hotel where the wallpaper worked hard to be understated. Carriages negotiated routes with the gravity of ships seeking channels. Conductors stamped, porters lifted, cousins waved from platforms that grew smaller at a manageable speed. If letters were left on the hall table for the couple to discover in their absence, the envelopes breathed gently until they came home. Under all the lace and timetable, there was a bureaucracy of tenderness. Feelings were translated into documents, announcements, licenses, registers, captions, and then back into memory. Nothing was left without a shelf. The sofa that had supervised courtship did not attend the wedding breakfast, but it deserves some credit for the logistics of love. It had trained people to sit near and to wait. In a century that liked rules, affection learned to move along formal routes and still arrive. You might think this would flatten romance, but it did something gentler. It made romance legible to everyone in the room. Grandparents could read it. Neighbors could read it. The family dog could probably read it. Sometimes a tradition wandered in as if it had lost its map. A horseshoe appeared on a ribbon for luck. A chimney sweep was invited to shake hands with the bride because it was supposedly fortunate if it belonged to a well-meaning man. These were theatrical flourishes adopted case by case. Practicality determined most everything else. The dress had to fit through doors. The bouquet had to survive the photo session. The register had to spell the names exactly the way those names intended to exist in the future. The cake had to taste of sugar and durability. The carriage had to leave before the weather changed its mind. It is easy, lying here and letting drowsiness pool like lamplight, to imagine those careful rooms. We can see gloves waiting in a row like polite fish. We can hear the waiter putting down cups with the elegant clink that means porcelain is content. We can smell beeswax on the pews and damp wool steaming its clean smell near the door where umbrellas have ceased to drip. We know that someone is telling a short story about a train, and someone else is counting place settings, and somewhere a bouquet is thinking heavy thoughts about gravity while pretending not to. Photography will put the day to bed later, as photography always does. Albums will gather it. Captions will give it labels so that memory will know which way is up. Children not yet born will open those pages and meet their families in their best eyebrows. A museum visitor, many years on, will look at a white dress and read a placard that mentions laundry and symbolism and find, unexpectedly, that the most touching thing is the tiny worn place at the hem where gravel had its say. Romance, it turns out, is often evidence of friction plus intention. Love is letting the hum be honest and then pressing it, all the same, for the album. Night comes, which is simply another kind of caption. The bells have finished their sentences. The hats go back to their boxes, which sigh shut like very polite clams. The ledger closes but remembers its numbers. On some windowsill, a myrtle sprig begins a new career as a pressed souvenir. It will darken with dignity. Somewhere in a traveling trunk, a rice grain will surprise its hosts in a pocket next week and make a small comedy of housekeeping. On the mantel, cards from well-wishers stand like a paper choir, singing gratitude in cursive. The soft bureaucracy continues in sleep. 2 rings learn each other's diameter. 2 names begin to share the same envelope. The world moves forward with its lists. Groceries for Monday, callers for Thursday. A train at 11 pass for the visit that will become a tradition by spring. The top tier of cake rests from its fame and settles into being an heirloom. The shoe that once clattered against the carriage returns to its sensible post in a wardrobe, decorated by history. If you're awake, you've traveled a long way with very little motion. You've sat in a parlor and observed safe distances. You've watched a dress invent a fashion, a bouquet speak fluent plant poetry, a photographer condense time to pause for 40 seconds. You've eaten breakfast at noon because language decided readiness matters more than the clock. You've seen paperwork behave like devotion and devotion behave like paperwork. None of this has required urgency. That is the quaint power of the Victorian wedding. It trusted order enough to let tenderness stroll at the most humane pace. It still does, in albums that hold more silence than ink. Somewhere, a final pen dries on a register where names now live as neighbors. The doors of the day close with a click no louder than a comma. What remains are neat lines, stitched lines, inked lines, train lines running gently forward. They carry the story without rushing it. They are wide enough for 2. They keep time the way a dozing cat keeps a sunbeam, absent-mindedly with great success. And as the room darkens lace and ledgers and all the small customs curl into comfortable corners, the last things to sleep are the gloves still buttoned, still confident that morning will find everyone exactly where they ought to be, ready to begin again with tea and lists and a pleasant slowness that makes even the clock feel drowsy. You might not expect a sofa to decide a romance, but in many Victorian parlors, the upholstery had far more authority than passion did. It set the distance. It issued silent guidance like a polite lighthouse. Here is the respectable coastline. Please do not dock too close. A chaperone, stationed with the serenity of furniture that has learned to breathe, watched the weather of conversation and nudged it toward clear skies. People learned to speak in sentences that could be shelved, small, dust-free, perfectly labeled with topics such as how pleasant the park looked and the latest serial installment. If you are still awake when I begin describing the etiquette of glove buttons, and there is etiquette, for glove buttons you may subscribe, but truly, you are not required to remain conscious. Victorian customs are happy to put themselves back on the shelf while you drift. Courtship started with calling cards, which were the administrative assistants of affection. Names lived on cream paper with edges that curled like a well-tempered mustache. You left a card to signal interest, and the household responded with its own card to signal that interest could be safely delivered to the parlor. Inside the room, courting couples spoke as though every word helped to qualify for a footnote. The dance was slow and designed for reliability, like a train timetable in pleasant weather. Books were lent as cautious ambassadors, Macaulay for approval, Tennyson for feelings, a gardening manual when nothing else felt safe. When a book returned without crumbs or penciled opinions, someone's future opened politely by a fraction. Notes were written in legible ink that kept its elbows off the margins. The post carried these letters like a discreet conspirator who believed secrets deserved punctuality. A chaperone did not forbid. She redirected. If conversation blushed, she adjusted the fire screen. If hands hovered in the area of sentiment, she discovered the urgent need to pour tea. The sofa, meanwhile, kept the topography of respect intact. A cushion might slide an inch to the right and therefore rescue an hour from suggestion. Courting couples perfected the art of admiring the same object from different ends of the mantel. A clock, a seashell, an unthreatening engraving of cattle. If weather permitted, a walk occurred never so fast that breathlessness could be confused with romance, and always at a distance that allowed a chaperone to pretend not to hear while hearing everything. Engagements arrived at a practical pace. The announcement behaved like a well-made suitcase, compact, sturdy, carrying exactly what would be needed later. A ring appeared modestly, as if it had borrowed the finger for safekeeping. Hair lockets were exchanged because the Victorians trusted hair to keep records better than memory does. Photographs in velvet cases opened with small sighs, like secrets that had practiced discretion. The local newspaper printed the future between advertisements for pianoforte, lessons, and the sale of a reliable phaeton. Families began composing the trousseau, linens that smelled faintly of starch and confidence, nightgowns sewn with seams prepared to last through opinions, and a drawer full of small tools that gave housekeeping the calm feeling of an organized expedition. Dates were chosen by a committee that included the parish calendar, the availability of good mutton, and the railway schedule, which had the final vote. Clothing, which Victorians frequently treated as a language, prepared to speak at a respectable volume. Early in the century, a bride wore her best dress, which might be dove gray, plum, or any color that promised well under gaslight. Then Queen Victoria chose white and transformed an everyday adjective into a lifelong ambition. White meant laundry, of course. It also meant a fresh piece of paper upon which a family could write new stories. Lace turned from decoration into biography. Honiton stitches told of nimble hands and the patience of villages. Silks whispered about trade routes and entire ships sailing so that one afternoon might feel special. A veil arranged the face inside a soft frame, like a portrait that has finally approved of itself. A bodice enforced posture with the moral energy of a headmistress who believed in shoulders. Gloves served as a form of punctuation. They finished a sentence. They paused the hand just long enough to keep impulse in its proper grammar. Buttons could be fastened with a tiny hook, the most Victorian of inventions, a device created to accomplish decision at a safe distance. Shoes were sensible interpreters of cobblestones, holding their opinions while still agreeing to look elegant on steps. A hint of blue appeared, often at the exact scale of a secret, a ribbon no wider than optimism, a thread on the hem seen only by the floor. Flowers spoke a dialect everyone pretended to understand. Orange blossom announced fertility with the calm certainty of a well-written ledger. Riddle proposed lasting love and proved it by refusing to die in water as quickly as one might expect. Massachusetts conservatories and Kentish hothouses arranged behind-the-scenes diplomacy so that bouquets could arrive in January and look like June. Florists tied meanings together with wire and greeted bewildered. Grooms with a narrow list of choices that amounted to a script. Boutonnieres echoed the bouquet because harmony is good for photographs and for ants. The groom dressed like a reliable sentence, morning coat, waistcoat, tie. Colors conversed quietly, charcoal stating a premise, cream offering support, a glint of watch chain functioning as a semicolon. The best man rehearsed the minimal choreography of rings, gloves, and speeches that would later be complimented as brief but sufficient. Bridesmaids formed a delicate constellation along the aisle. Brighter than stars would be under glass. The service followed the Book of Common Prayer with a confidence similar to that of a seasoned bat. Bands had been called on the preceding Sundays so that romance could be inspected by the acoustics. If impediments were going to emerge, they were given a dignified stage, and then, by not appearing, they endorsed the union. The procession was unhurried because pace suggests certainty. Organ music reinforced the architecture, extracting echoes from stone that had its own long memory of vows. At the lectern, the clergyman unfolded sentences designed to endure. Vows were spoken aloud so that walls and rafters and the occasional distractible sparrow could serve as witnesses. The register waited in the vestry like a quiet official who has learned never to leave a page unsigned. Names meant everything there. They were written not for the day, but for the years when descendants would practice their genealogy while a kettle warmed. Signatures met in ink and shook metaphorical hands. If the groom's handwriting devoted unnecessary flourish to an initial, nobody complained. The line beneath recognized enthusiasm as long as it kept to its lane. 2 witnesses signed and stepped back, knowing they had joined the minor nobility of documents. Victorian photography, which moved with the dignity of glaciers, preferred studios to weather. Exposure times invited stillness. The camera asked subjects to become furniture for 20 seconds, and then very politely gave them back their humanity. Many couples scheduled portraits after the wedding because ceremonies refused to wait while cameras assembled their thoughts. The studio offered a background library in which nobody had to read, and a chunk of marble disguised as a column that suggested the couple enjoyed ancient virtues. A metal prop, an invisible cousin, supported the head from behind to prove that serenity could be engineered. Photographers coaxed bouquets and arranged hymns. They knew how to ask for affection that looked good on paper, a hand that rested rather than clutched, a gaze that traveled in the general direction of the horizon and returned on time. The final cartes de visite were slid into albums with slits shaped like respect. On their backs, captions recorded the unglamorous details, date, parish, the clergyman's initials, which would later matter more than the pose. Confetti had a pleasant career as Rice's understudy. Where grain was scarce or the beetle forbade enthusiastic scattering, paper performed joy in small geometric units. A satin shoe tied to the carriage announced departure with friendly clacks, as if the road itself were applauding. The crowd offered cheers, not too many, in case the horse had nerves. Bells played encores. A chimney sweep might shake the bride's hand, which supposedly promised luck, and certainly promised a story. Trunks had been packed with lists and then double-checked by someone whose life had taught them to mistrust the confidence of lists. Tickets nested in a pocketbook, pleased by their own crisp paper smell. The first journey might be a practical short trip to a quiet seaside, a cousin's neat spare bedroom, or a modest hotel where wallpaper had been selected for its determination to remain unfashionable forever. The wedding breakfast owned the charming habit of occurring at noon. In a century devoted to categorization, the phrase survived like a small private joke no committee could edit. Tables wore their most articulate linen. China negotiated a peace treaty with light that made every cup look thinner than reason. Courses behaved modestly and without sauces that endangered silk. Toasts attempted warmth while remaining, as minutes go, commendably brief. Wine helped but did not lead. The cake towered in tiers that represented the general structure of society, with the top tier wrapped away to serve later when time had done interesting things to sweetness. Fruitcake cooperated with preservation by being, at its core, a geological ambition. The ledger of gifts earned a place at a side table, where an aunt conducted the quiet symphony of acknowledgement. Names lined up, items followed. Thank you notes occupied their own column. To modern eyes, a gift ledger may look like bureaucracy. To Victorians, it looked like gratitude given a backbone. Things could be found later. Who sent the butter dish shaped like a water lily? Who sponsored the bed linens with the surprisingly optimistic monogram? Who provided the travel rugs so thick it felt like persuasion? A dependable nephew ferried plates. A small cousin attempted to blow out the wrong candle and was gently persuaded to try again later, at birthdays, where that talent would shine. Guests converse best when surrounded by cutlery that implies competence. Uncles explained the mysteries of the railway timetable as if the trains themselves consulted them personally. Aunts exchanged intelligence on flower markets and laundresses. Friends speculated on the quality of the lodging house without admitting that none of them had stayed there. The bride and groom smiled and sat and stood like benevolent monarchs whose nation was half tea, half paperwork. The room held together not by spectacle, but by steady things chairs that did their job. A clock that suggested, not commanded, and a window that arranged light in flattering rectangles. At departure, the social machine clicked softly. Cloaks appeared, gloves located their matched partners, hats performed their last well-behaved tilt. Signature pages were checked again because documents love to be admired. The couple stepped out and the day folded itself like a map after a pleasant journey. Many households saved the newspaper announcement in a scrapbook. Even if the paragraph read like a small notice about weather, it kept the tone of public blessing. Albums acquired the studio portrait. The bouquet, slightly exhausted, began its second life pressed between pages of sermons where it would turn quiet and brown and solemnly intact. Small absurdities were not accidents. They were cushioning. If a horseshoe trinket dangled from the bride's wrist, it insisted on happiness by pretending to be iron. If someone slipped a sixpence into a shoe, the coin performed optimism for the foot without injuring the arch. White dresses learned the language of mud and forgave. Veils tangled and untangled with far more patience than mythology grants them. Even the organist, caught in a draft and suddenly committed to an unintended reprise, created only interest, never scandal. The system absorbed irregularities the way blotting paper swallows ink and leaves the page legible. Underneath, everything was a practice in record keeping. The century did not trust memory to do all the work. It wrote love into ledgers and registers, into invitations and receipts, into diaries that accounted for the weather and the color of ties. Not because romance required supervision exactly, but because people understood that memory appreciates assistance. In quiet rooms years later, The evidence would reassemble the day for anyone who wanted to listen. A child tracing their family tree would find the signatures and discover how a grandfather looped his G. A historian would examine the veil's lace and write a paragraph about Honiton that made the town blush. A stranger in a museum would study a blank-faced photograph and feel, without knowing why, that the bouquet had been heavy and the head support slightly cool. It is possible to feel sleepy in the comfortable way that window seats cause, just by listing these customs. Count with me: the distance on the sofa, the slope of the calling card script, the frictionless glide of a new pen nib, the quiver of a blue ribbon when somebody opens a door, the careful way a ring decides which knuckle comes first, the folded napkin, the mild ache of a bouquet that has always wanted to be bigger than it is, the neat book in the vestry that smells faintly of dust and confidence. The mind drifts, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening at a pace the body recognizes humane. If you are awake enough for one more small fact, try this. Many photographers kept a shelf of props labeled not by name but by effect. Gravitas, prosperity, domestic peace. People selected a chair that promised the future they preferred. And here is a tiny punchline with the manners of a whisper. The prop that delivered domestic peace most reliably was a fern. Victorians loved ferns. They looked like discipline that had learned to curve. Album after album shows a couple beside a fern, as if the plant had agreed to co-sign the mortgage. By night the house is quiet again. The sofa returns to its ordinary jurisdiction over novels. The ledger sleeps under its blotter, pages cooling from the day's arithmetic of gratitude. Somewhere a shoe tied to the carriage door has been politely untied, ready to be a shoe again. The pressed myrtle waits between pages for its long experiment with time. The white dress hangs like a moon at rest, while a knowledgeable aunt murmurs that the hem should never be bruised on storage. The couple considers the railway timetable with the concentration of cartographers. In the calm, it is easy to believe that order is the softest pillow. If you have slipped toward sleep, that is simply you agreeing with Victorian pacing. If you have stayed awake, you have traveled a small country with low borders. From a parlor where the sofa makes policy to a vestry where ink discovers nerve to a studio where a fern signs. Paperwork to a breakfast table where fruitcake practices immortality. The customs hold together not because they are grand, but because they are gentle. They trust paper, patience, and chairs. And as the last spell of the day remembers to be quiet, the album lid shuts with a sigh any household would recognize, the sound of something content to be kept, to be found again, to be read slowly on another afternoon when the light is good and the kettle understands its cue. You might not expect the sofa to supervise romance, yet in the Victorian parlor a stout piece of upholstery possessed more authority than any whispering heart. Its springs enforced respect, its floral pattern counseled moderation. It separated knees the way a railway timetable separates stations, politely at predictable intervals. The room itself was a set of quiet instructions in mahogany. Calling cards sat in a silver tray like small, well-behaved birds watching the door, and telling the story of who had come to visit and for how long, and whether they had the handwriting of a trustworthy person. A chaperone enjoyed the practical power of an extra chair, always present, never dramatic, and capable of scooting very near the tea table if the conversation dared to accelerate. If you're still awake by the time we reach the protocol of hat placement, Brim East, never West, unless there is a piano, feel free to subscribe. But only if your eyelids agree. They are the senior partners in this negotiation. Courtship functioned like filing. A young gentleman carried sentiments in discreet envelopes labeled safely with neutral subjects, such as the health of mother, the condition of the roads, and the merits of new gas mantles. A young lady replied with impeccable penmanship and a sentence ending that never surprised anyone. Books traveled between houses like quiet diplomats, a volume of sermons that had excellent posture. a novel wrapped in brown paper to prevent the plot from alarming the wallpaper, a botanical guide with pressed leaves that kept secrets. If a note contained poetry, it arrived in a careful second paragraph, chaperoned by a remark about rainfall. The language of affection formed itself out of small, sturdy phrases, each trimmed so that it could pass through the narrow doorways of propriety without bumping its elbows. The parlor clock, meanwhile, kept confidences in quarter-hour units. It never hurried Victorian time, disliked sprinting, and it never gossiped, even when the maid dusted it and asked silently for details. Announcements rarely erupted. They appeared the way well-behaved muffins appear at tea, on time, lightly sugared, arranged in a hierarchy of plates. A ring surfaced with the modesty of a coin in a fountain, pretending to be surprised by its own sparkle. Hair lockets, which make modern people blink, made perfect sense to Victorians. Hair kept its promises better than anything in the stationery drawer. The local newspaper published the engagement between a notice about a missing terrier and an advertisement for boots guaranteed never to squeak in church. Families clipped the announcement and slid it into albums where straight lines were a moral achievement. The trousseau began as an inventory and gathered courage, a stack of linen that smelled faintly of starch and tomorrow, nightgowns with logical seams, a drawer of needles that looked ready to organize the universe. Shoes were discussed gravely, nightcaps remained tactful, even in conversation. Somewhere in the house, an aunt assembled a list titled Things Not to Forget, which include, without irony, the entry list. Clothing took its audition seriously. Early in the century, a bride might simply wear her best dress, which often had opinions about color plum, slate, dove, or a determined green. Then Queen Victoria chose white, and an entire empire of laundry rose to salute. White acted as a thesis statement, blank, hopeful, prepared for annotations. Lace was the footnote. Honiton lace told everyone that needlework had taken time, village time, the sort of time that builds character and also sore fingers. A veil turned the face into a soft statue momentarily on loan from the Greek department. Gloves supplied punctuation. They announced commas where the hand might otherwise offer exclamation points. The bodice performed the miracle of posture, which Victorians admired the way sailors admire a trusted compass. Shoes quietly accepted the fact of cobblestones. Flowers employed an indoor weather service. Orange blossom signaled fertility with the confidence of a textbook. Myrtle suggested lasting love, agreeable to both horticulture and poetry. A hint of blue ran through the outfit like a private joke shared with the sky. Bouquets were sized to be carried while also navigating doors, pews, relatives, and the sudden appearance of a sentimental dog. Battenmares echoed the bouquet in a smaller font. Even the ribbon seemed to know that it was responsible for morale. The language of flowers, which never stops being pleased with itself, allowed people to say fairly tender things without moving their eyebrows. It is the historical cousin of the office memo that accidentally contains a poem. The service followed the Book of Common Prayer, which knew how to arrange meaning into sentences that didn't wobble, even when someone forgot their place. Bands had been read on previous Sundays so that any objections could rehearse, and then decide politely not to attend. The aisle measured expectation in rectangular steps. An organ discovered acoustics inside stone and spent them generously. The clergyman, who probably had very dignified elbows, unfolded a short sermon about covenant and patience, followed by vows built like bridges. Names were spoken family ones, legal ones, so they could belong to the room as much as to the people in it. Somewhere in the back, a child admired a feather and memorized nothing else, which is also a kind of attendance. The register waited in the vestry with a calm sheet of paper that had already judged everyone favorably. Ink behaved. Signatures appeared in a sequence that felt ceremonial to the pen nib. Witnesses signed with the solemn authority of persons who own umbrellas. The pages turned as softly as fresh bread. Outside, hats bowed and unbowed. Buttons felt useful. In a pew, an aunt dabbed her eyes, not to cry tears stained silk, but to perform a respectable version of joy that could be aired in company, without needing a handkerchief with monogrammed thunder. Photographs, the slow thunder of the era, usually happened after the wedding, when the couple had time to hold still, and the camera had time to forgive them. Studios provided backgrounds with bookcases that contained no readable titles, and plinths that were proud to have no purpose beyond being substantial. A hidden metal support hugged the back of the head like an impersonal friend. Photographers arranged the train of the dress as if negotiating a minor treaty between fabric and gravity. Poses implied affection not by contact, which the future might misinterpret, but by axis, two figures aligned like thoughtful compasses sharing a horizon. Cards to visite dried on racks and then slid into albums that made every living room into a museum with strictly limited hours. On the back, someone wrote date, parish, and the useful phrase, "Aunt Belinda's fern not pictured," because ferns, like families, were everywhere. Breakfast, the word politely pretending that roast chicken is a cousin of toast, began at noon and behaved like a watered garden. Nothing overwhelmed anything else. Tea steamed. Cream made its precise, shining argument. The cake rose in diplomatic tiers, each layer consulting the one below before adding candied opinions. The top tier retired early to a tin, destined for christenings and anniversaries, and therefore acquiring the distinct moral flavor of patience. Speeches kept a strict curfew. Glasses clinked softly, the way ideas clink when they agree. A ledger of gifts lay open on a small table, where a responsible relation, usually an aunt whose handwriting had posture, recorded the generosity of every guest. Spoon, 2 silver. Tray, electroplated. Rug, travel warm. Clock, reliable. The book looked bureaucratic, but in truth it was a device for manufacturing gratitude on schedule. Children invented games with confetti. Adults pretended not to step on it. Someone tied a tiny satin shoe to the carriage, which produced a gentle clatter like applause from a polite machine. A sweep might offer a city handshake for luck, which made everyone feel they had met industrial progress personally. The bride's friends pinned a sprig of rosemary for a remembrance on the cloak of the future. The groom's friends contemplated the strange future in which he would own an alarming quantity of napkins. Guests lined the steps as if they were punctuation marks, deciding where the sentence would end. It didn't end. It continued down the pavement at the pace of a well-meaning horse. The first journey was not necessarily exotic. Sometimes it was simply the near seaside where waves performed small, identical bows, or a cousin's spare room where the eiderdown had political opinions. Valises contained optimism packed between shirts. Tickets lived in a pocketbook with a snap that sounded like self-confidence. A timetable folded its columns neatly, announcing that time too, intended to be helpful. The bride looked out a window and saw hedges passing like green commas. The groom looked at the same hedges and thought quite sincerely about breakfast. The porter did not require a narrative. He required the luggage to hold together. Hotels greeted couples with wallpaper designed to offend nobody, which is its own art form. Meanwhile, back at home, the house reassembled itself with the relieved sigh of a room that has performed beautifully. Chairs returned to their usual spacing, no longer enlisted as sentries. The sofa relaxed its moral muscles. Flowers tried a new career as potpourri. Stray rice behaved like geological history in miniature, turning up for months. The newspaper with the announcement found its way to the scrapbook, where headlines about war politely sidled up to a paragraph about a very pleasing ceremony. It is a particular Victorian talent, too. Store joy between advertisements for hat pins and cod liver oil, and still have it work. Oddities existed, as they always do, politely. Some families kept the cake's little decorative pillars forever, because small columns are harder to throw away than feelings. Some brides sewed the coin from their shoe into a purse that would then quietly boast of prudence for decades. A few couples tried to take a photograph outdoors and were rewarded with a picture of wind. Rings were sometimes tied to the ring bearer's glove with ribbon, not symbolism, to prevent the ring from making ambitious plans. The groom's boutonniere always faced the same problem, staying alive long enough to be remembered. It usually succeeded, like a heroic green comma. What remains striking is the paperwork of feeling. Love is mentioned naturally. More often, it is filed. There are calling cards, letters, fans, registers, invitations, thank you notes, and lists. There is handwriting, much of it determined to please the future by leaning forward at the same carefully optimistic angle. There are albums that expect grandchildren. There are drawers that trust the mothballs. We could consider this excessive, yet it possesses the odd tenderness of organization. To record something is to believe it deserves to be looked up later. The Victorians looked up love the way a librarian looks up maps, slowly, accurately, with a ruler. If we return gently to the parlor where it began, we find the sofa still doing its job with civic pride. In its cushions are the fossilized remnants of 1,000 conversations that never tripped over themselves. The clock claims the quarter hour as if time were a friendly subscription. The chaperone's chair stands exactly where it always stood, equal parts guardian and furniture. Evening brings lamplight, which is merely daylight slowed down for thinking. A book left open to chapter 10 admits to nothing scandalous. A folded shawl practices being a horizon. The house listens to itself and hears only wholesome echoes. Somewhere, the new couple opens a tin and finds the top tier of the wedding cake engaged in its favorite hobby, which is being the future at a manageable speed. A slice tastes like continuity with raisins. Toasts are remembered in a more flattering order. A satin shoe returns to its vocation. The ledger closes with one last contented rustle, an unusually polite noise for paper. The bouquet rests in a basin like a retired officer, its petals telling small stories to the water. We could keep walking this slow hallway of details, forever gloves stored flat, the precise temperature of sealing wax, the rule that photographs should be dusted clockwise so as not to confuse the memories. But sleep is already placing its own lace veil over the room. If you are still listening, you may notice the tiniest absurdity. The fern in the wedding photograph, standing beside the couple like a green witness, will outlive almost everything else in the picture. It will be divided when it grows too pleased with itself, given to cousins, watered by nieces, dusted by someone who never attended the ceremony, but who dusts loyally every Saturday. Victorians would like that. It is the sort of continuity one can write in a ledger. So let the sofa deflate its principles by an inch. Let the parlor clock negotiate an armistice with the dark. Let the signatures in the register dry entirely and then fall asleep in their careful loops. The white dress waits on its hanger like a moon that has gone indoors. The world folds itself neatly, prepares a label, and places it on the day, accomplished, with appropriate refreshments. And you, somewhere between bouquet and timetable, may drift the way trains do when the countryside agrees to be soft, steadily, without urgency, in a direction chosen quietly by the rails. You might not expect a hole in a skirt to be the hero of technological progress, but pockets begin with a slit, and the slit is patient. It waits along a seam like a tiny doorway that refuses to brag. In the Middle Ages, clothing preferred to be a curtain rather than a cupboard, so a person tied a little bag around the waist under layers of wool, then reached through a vertical opening to borrow a coin, a knife, or a crumb of nutmeg that made stew feel respected. The bag had a drawstring with the quiet confidence of things that will never learn to shout. Tailors cut those slits with the same tidy seriousness used for confessionals in castle arrow loops. They understood that security is mostly a matter of being slightly inconvenient to strangers. If you are still awake by the time we reach the pocket-sized moral philosophy of where to keep a house key when the house has a moat, you're welcome to subscribe. or simply place that intention in a mental pocket and let it nap there indefinitely. The early pouch swung like a pendulum, under layers of fabric, a small clock with only 2 times, find and forget. Women wore them tied at the waist, men attached them to belts, and both discovered that a bag wants to become a personality. Some were leather with the practical charm of a boot. Some were linen with initials that behaved like tiny heraldic banners. A few enjoyed beadwork the way stars enjoy winter. Thieves practiced the art of the cut purse, which is less romantic when you imagine the precise angle of the blade and the feel of someone suddenly lighter by one pouch. In crowded streets, a hand could do arithmetic with knots faster than the owner could do ethics, so responsibility moved inward. Garments learned to shelter the pocket like a chapel shelters a whisper. The slit hid in the seam. The pouch waited, warm, secret, and faintly proud of hoarding the pepper that made banquets forgive. Themselves docked, the Renaissance matured the pocket with the same energy it lavished on ceilings. Inventories list pocketing, a fabric kind to coins. Tailors, who are half poets and half engineers, found that a pocket also solves gravity. Put weight in the sleeve and the arm sulks. Put weight in a waistband and the skirt votes against it. But put weight in a pouch suspended from strings and the mass politely goes where you go. Soon there were 2, one for respectability and one for everything else. Recipes, keys, thimbles, a flint, the very small folded letter that says nothing scandalous in language that nonetheless blushes. It all traveled quietly. In domestic dramas, the rhythm of the day could be heard in the soft rattle against the thigh. Morning flint, noon needle, evening key. Somewhere a manuscript mentions a woman hiding a pear in her pocket for a later moment with herself and a bench. History is full of grand battles, but this is the sort of logistics that actually keeps people awake until the kettle is done. Then the 17th century invented a kind of architectural clothing, and pockets became real estate. Men's coats gained hanging galleries of cloth in which one might keep a snuff box, a watch the size of a small astronomy, a folded peruke bill, a penknife, and a biscuit in case philosophy ran long. Women kept their tie-on pouches, which were so normal that nobody wrote poems about them, a reliable sign of usefulness. They were large enough to fit a baby's shoe, a skein of silk, and a prayer book that would not admit to gossip. If the pocket had the personality of a room, it was an attic. Nobody visited it socially, but everyone felt better knowing it existed. Occasionally, a fire consumed a house and the pocket saved the key to another house, which is the sort of modest heroism pockets prefer. The 18th century's silhouettes narrowed, widened, narrowed again, like streets arguing with architects, and pockets adapted with domestic wisdom. A pair lived under the petticoat, reached through slits in the gown. Painters show a hand emerging from ruffles as if from a cloud, holding a watch or nothing, which is also something when the pocket keeps secrets as a public service. Embroidered pockets survive in museums with flowers that have not wilted since the year they were stitched. The threads loop and knot around the idea of ownership. This is mine, and it is close to my body, and it will travel with me when the room cannot. Girls learn to sew pockets as they learn to read out loud, and both skills produce the same slow confidence. There are court records describing pickpockets who mistook a skirt slit for invitation and were disappointed to meet a fist. The legal term for this is educational. Industrialization rearranged everything, including the dressmaker's sense of where the body ends and the day begins. Trousers for laborers developed pockets shaped like answers. Breeches had a full front, but trousers offered a fly and then a pair of slant pockets that invited the hand like honesty invites relief. Coin pockets appeared, insisting that even money requires a private room. Tailors learned to reinforce pocket mouths with bar tacks, which is the clothing equivalent of adding parentheses to a difficult sentence. The waistcoat evolved the welt pocket, a horizontal wink cut into wool, neat as an oath taken rightly. Watches retired from being necklaces and took up residence close to the heart, which no one minded, not even poets. The watch chain draped a little arc across the waistcoat like proof that mathematics had learned to relax. Women's fashion took a different route, as it often does when an era revises the map without revising the compass. The 19th century loved smooth lines and emphasized decoration that sat on the outside like friendly authority. Many dresses lost their slits and their tie-on pouches and retreated to the reticule, a small handbag that resembled a polite lantern. Reticules were excellent for appearing elegant and not very good at carrying a potato for later. Pockets existed, but not reliably, and so the skirt itself sometimes concealed them like a good joke told only once. When they were there, they were deep and generous. When they weren't, women invented hidden places in sleeves, bodices, and the geography of ingenuity. Diaries complained softly. One can measure a society by how many of its women have to ask someone else to hold a thing while they tie a ribbon dot. Meanwhile, men's pockets became biographies. The breast pocket after 1830 was a stage for a handkerchief folded into an opinion. Tailors angled it to avoid sagging, a kind of structural virtue. In the hip pockets, a man might keep a railway timetable that knew exactly when each town preferred to be visited. The back pocket arrived late and quickly learned to be careful. It is the pocket least suited to sitting, and therefore the one most likely to hold something valuable, which is an irony that has applied to empires. Tools acquired holsters, notebooks found homes, pencils kept the kind of company graphite likes. You can hear the history of commerce in the sound of a pocket opening in a counting house, the small flump of cloth, the whisper of paper, the click of coins counting themselves. Sailors had pockets sewn into wide trousers because ships are jealous of loose items. A cabin boy kept his rations on one side and his scrimshaw on the other, a diet for the body and a diet for the hands. Miners preferred rule-of-thumb garments that could be read in the dark. If the right pocket holds the candle stump and the left holds the tin of tea, the world is in order. If reversed, either you're very tired or something dramatic has happened with tea. In both cases, the pocket is the first witness to give testimony, and it does so without adjectives. By the 20th century, pocket politics became explicitly modern. The tailored suit distributed pockets like small, specialized ministries. Ticket pockets perched above right hip pockets, small lobbyists for trains. The breast pocket for a pen declared literacy in ink. Inside breast pockets became the diplomatic pouch of documents, passports, love letters that kept their sentences obedient with a paperclip. On battlefields, pockets stood in for drawers, desks, and sometimes walls. Soldiers wrote home from their pockets, carried photographs in them, and returned with pebbles, which work as souvenirs because they don't argue with memory. Some uniforms stitched watch pockets in the cuff, which seems absurd until you are marching and wish to know the hour without consulting the sky, which is sometimes busy. Women's pockets experienced an era of arguments disguised as fashion. Flapper dresses abandoned bulk and asked handbags to assume responsibility. Then workwear returned the pocket with the practicality of factories and buses. In wartime, a woman's coat might hide ration books, knitting needles, and the patience to stand in line while remaining fundamentally kind. Afterward, fashion ran back and forth like a committee unsure which page they were discussing. Designers spoke about lines and silhouettes. Wearers spoke about keys and hands. When a dress had pockets, women mentioned this fact the way one mentions electricity, still a wonder, still a relief, and always relevant to the evening. A curious offshoot of pocket history is the secret, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes brilliant, compartment. There are pockets inside top hats, where notes and folded emergency maps could dream of taller ideas. There were pockets in books that were not entirely books. There was a waistcoat with 24 pockets marketed to travelers who underestimated how often they would want an orange at arm's length. There were pickpocket-proof pockets, which turned out to be proof only against honest people. There was the Napoleon-era rumor of a sewn-in pocket just for a snuff spoon, which seems specialized until you consider how modern jackets host a pocket dedicated entirely to a rectangle of glass that asks you to touch it 800 times a day. The psychology of pockets is domestic. We reach into them to confirm the world is still where we left it. Keys answer like well-trained bells. Notes emerge creased into topographies of previous days. Found coins feel lucky because they are ours twice. Laundry becomes archaeological. A movie stub declares that we were once in a chair with strangers. A dried leaf proves that a park held us for a moment. A screw suggests that somewhere a chair is slightly less certain than it was. People apologize to pockets as they turn clothes inside out, and pockets, being cloth, forgive everything. Etiquette has always negotiated with pockets. Hands in pockets imply ease or defiance or a cold day. Tailoring decides which gesture is permitted by permitting or denying depth. A shallow pocket is a sermon about posture. A deep pocket is a novel about keeping the novel. The phrase deep pockets wanders into finance and refuses to come back. In courtrooms, as in cafes, a pocketed hand becomes a pause in need of a sentence. Some museums ask visitors to store bags but allow pockets, which is a reminder that civility trusts small places more than large ones. Children learn pockets as a kind of grammar. The first treasure is a rock that has selected the child rather than the reverse. Next comes the decisive leaf, the heroic button, the crumbly cookie. Parents empty pockets before washing and become curators of a traveling exhibition titled Evidence of a Day. Teenagers adopt the hoodie as a garment constructed around a pouch. An architecture for fidgeting. Grandparents keep peppermints that taste like a calm room. When a person dies, their pockets are emptied with the solemn efficiency of those who know that a life is both bigger and smaller than receipts. The absurdities are gentle. There's the coat with an inside pocket so deep that you find last winter waving from the bottom. There's the pocket sewn shut by the factory as an invitation to be opened, a reminder that some freedoms arrive with a basting stitch. There is the famous instruction to not place heavy objects in the pocket, printed on labels attached to trousers that will meet wrenches, wallets, and the gravity of habit. There is the uncanny fact that we sometimes pat our pockets for a phone that is already in our hand. A ritual proving that the body occasionally misfiles reality. Modern technical clothing multiplies pockets happily, like a spreadsheet with pockets for columns. Hiking jackets offer chest pockets, Napoleon pockets, sleeve pockets that could host a treaty between a granola bar and altitude. Cyclists enjoy back pockets as a topographical feature. Chefs prefer an apron with a pen slot that has memorized which side is right. The word cargo turns a thigh into a warehouse and stirs debate at dinner tables. A minimalist will announce that one needs only one pocket used well. A maximalist proves otherwise with 8. Both fall asleep eventually, and their pockets do not argue while they do. When a designer removes pockets from a dress, the internet sighs in a single direction. When a designer adds them, the applause is domestic and deep. There is something dignified about a hand resting in a piece of cloth that exists, because someone decided dignity should be convenient. Even in formal wear, secret pockets bloom. There are tiny ones in waistbands for emergency safeness, a luxury defined by the absence of panic. Tailors still draw chalk lines and stitch welts with old confidence. Pockets are one way a garment promises to be useful after the mirror has finished talking. We might end where we began, with a slit that keeps its manners. The tie-on pocket survives in costume drawers and living memory, a technology that never entirely retired. If you slip one on under a skirt and reach through the seam, history recognizes you with a small nod. You can keep a key next to your pulse and a note next to both. You can walk through a market and weigh apples one at a time while your other hand rests in certainty. In the quiet of a museum, you can look at an embroidered pocket with vines and birds and imagine the woman who stitched it knowing exactly where she would tuck the recipe for plum cake, and now, with your own pockets, perhaps carrying nothing more dangerous than warmth, you can allow the story to fold itself and be put away. The earliest pouch settles against the body like a pet asleep under fabric. The watch slides back into its welt with a private tick. The scattered receipts organize themselves into a forgiving stack that promises to be dealt with tomorrow. The official holiday of paperwork. Keys settle. Coins stop practicing their language. The day, somewhat used, is still perfectly serviceable and can be slipped into the inner pocket where soft-line things go. If a loose thread tickles your palm, that is only the seam reminding you that utility is a kind of kindness. The rest is simple. Breathe and let your thoughts click shut like a pocket clasp, one by one, until even the last little compartment of awake has been gently, neatly, wonderfully closed. You might not expect a crumpled slip of paper to have an autobiography, but receipts remember more than most diaries and judge less. They are small and rectangular and generally tired. They live in pockets like shy neighbors and come out only when asked to prove where bread came from. A receipt has the personality of a window shade, unassuming, helpful, content to roll up and vanish. The earliest ones weren't paper at all. They were clay nodules and little tokens impressed with marks that meant 2 jars of oil, or yes. We saw the sheep. Someone pressed a reed into wet clay. The way you press a button on an elevator and then wait obediently. When the clay dried, the agreement did too. If you're still awake by the time we reach carbonless copy paper, you're welcome to subscribe. Or not, the receipt won't notice. It will be here either way, quietly listing what happened, and occasionally what did not dot in the beginning. The receipt was not for shoppers, but for grain that went into someone else's granary and would ideally come back out again. The receipt was the memory a farmer could carry in a palm. Scribes set up shop where goods changed hands and time changed shape. They made neat lines with a stylus and counted barley like a patient metronome. In some places, tablets were sealed in little clay envelopes, which is bureaucracy's version of a matryoshka doll. There were bulla that held tokens representing loaves. And when the harvest felt especially dramatic, everything received a countermark, which is a very old word for calm down. We wrote it. A receipt in clay is heavy enough to sit on a table and suggest honesty by density. You can imagine a conversation that sounds like jars being set down. Here is the measure. Here is the mark. Here is the echo of a promise hardening in the sun. Wood took a turn next, because trees are generous to accountants. Tally sticks split into recorded debts and payments with notches that climb the grain like tiny staircases. One half lived with the lender, the other with the borrower, and the sticks fit together again the way facts like to. It was a comforting technology. Wood does not attempt poetry unless forced, and even then it settles for a metaphor about growth. Kings accepted taxes recorded this way. Villagers paid rents. Markets secured a peace founded on matching grooves. There is a mildly absurd detail historians cannot resist repeating. In 1834, a great old pile of obsolete tallies was tossed into a furnace beneath the Houses of Parliament and, in the enthusiastic tradition of cleaning days, helped burn the building more thoroughly than intended. Even the ashes were a kind of receipt proof that memory had been settled and moved elsewhere. The lesson is that paperwork, if insulted, will perform one last audit. Once parchment and paper became friendly to pens, receipts learned to be thin. They grew margins and manners. Medieval merchants wrote notes that said things like, "Received of Thomas 6 ells of broadcloth," in a hand that had clearly practiced. The ell, in case you're comfortably drifting, was roughly the length of an arm that had decided to be useful. In Florence, a cloth dealer might sign with a flourish that looked a little like wind. In London, a scrivener recorded a tally in ink the color of old tea. Receipts for dowry installments read like the staging instructions for a very careful play. There were chits for candles and entries for spices whose names suggested travel mace. Cinnamon, grains of paradise, each one a ticket stub from a voyage you never took but tasted anyway. A receipt suddenly felt companionable, like a clerk who had found a stool tall enough to be dignified. Guilds kept them. Monasteries kept them. Small shops pressed them between ledger leaves where accounts slept in pairs. They were bilingual, sometimes trilingual, because money enjoys conversation. Even illiterate buyers expected a mark. One could sign with a cross, and the cross would stand up straight as if wearing a tie. Wax seals joined in, sticky, solemn, and always a little tempted to smudge. There were receipts for the rent of stalls in market halls, for pew rights in churches, and for bridge tolls charged to pack mules who never asked for a receipt but were counted anyway. We find notes admitting payment in peppercorns, an arrangement everyone pretended was normal because it was easier to count than favor. If you've ever received a receipt for a souvenir magnet and felt that the magnet had been awarded second prize, you and a Venetian spice clerk would get along. The printed world multiplied receipts, the way spring multiplies weeds, cheerfully without seeking permission. By the 18th century, pre-ruled forms appeared, with blanks where truth could walk in and sign its name. There were copperplate headings that took up half the page, because style is also an accounting entry. Printers sold receipts ready for the writing of the particulars, a phrase that sounds like a polite invitation to gossip. As shops grew busier and registers arrived, the receipt started traveling with the customer rather than staying home in a book. It became portable applause. You could see in the typographic ornaments that someone, somewhere, took pleasure in the little flourish at the top that said paid, as if it had been waiting its whole life to say so. Cash registers added sound effects. James Ritty's machine in the 1870s rang a bell when the drawer opened, a noise that has convinced many generations that honesty can be measured in C-sharp. Early registers were called incorruptible, which is a generous adjective for furniture. Soon they sprouted paper rolls, and the receipt acquired a tail. Clerks learned to cheer with a wrist flick that looked practiced because it was. Paper tape printed numbers that felt official even before ink had dried. On busy Saturdays, you could stand near the counter and watch language. Arrive in digits. 1.25 for flour and a comfortable number of eggs. 0.10 for thread. 0.00 for the smile that came with both. The machine kept a copy because machines trust themselves, and the customer took another because customers trust future arguments. Then came the carbon era, which taught receipts to exist in layers like cake. To fill out one was to press down hard enough with a pen to send ink through a colored inner leaf, so the shop could keep one and the customer another. Hands learned pressure required, a firm, honest weight that also did well at signing birthday cards. Some companies added a third copy that nobody knew what to do with, but everyone kept, which is how bureaucracy expresses affection. Offices bought forms with little tick boxes for goods received in good order, a phrase that behaves like a yawn. Once one person says it, everyone else feels it. Receipts started to sprout disclaimers and conditions on the back in tiny print. A dense forest of words promising that nothing surprising would occur, and apologizing in case it did not return policies, grew like hedges around the receipt's lawn. 30 days, 14, 7, in-store credit only. Stamps added dates. Clerks initialed corners. Managers initialed the clerk's initials. The little metal date stamp thumped, leaving a scar the receipt wore with pride. Some stores used purple ink that faded into mysteriousness within a year, as if the receipt preferred to become legend. You could open a wallet and find a time capsule from last winter's boots, now quietly resolved. Cabbies wrote amounts on perforated slips with carbon that left fingerprints like friendly ghosts. Hotels handed you folios that folded into themselves with practiced shyness. The paper knew when to whisper. Thermal paper arrived with the unassuming ambition of any kitchen gadget that eventually changes a civilization. It allowed receipts to appear without ink. A heated print had coaxed letters out of a chemical coating, the way heat coaxes stories out of tea. This made receipts faster, lighter, and very slightly mysterious. They resisted ballpoint notes. They turned black near sunlight as if embarrassed. Everyone learned accidentally that leaving one on the car dashboard gave it a suntan that obliterated the tip line. Cashiers tore and handed and tore again while the machine hummed a small hymn to friction. At the end of the day, a long ribbon spilled from the till, the Z-tape, which sounds like a cipher but is simply the cash register's bedtime story. Modern receipts discovered marketing and could not resist a speech. Now they stretch like tiny newspapers. They print coupons for items that misread your soul in a friendly way. You purchase a carrot, and the receipt earnestly suggests fertilizer and a bar of chocolate, which is not wrong. Loyalty points elbow themselves into the narrative. A QR code lounges in the corner like a polite bouncer. The store thanks you 3 times with decreasing formality. Receipts began to include surveys promising a chance to win something the size of a breakfast. You're invited to tell us how we did, and somewhere a spreadsheet practices empathy. The bottom says, see reverse for terms. Though the reverse offers only the antique romance of blankness, there is, of course, the email receipt, a plot twist that replaced the pocket with the inbox. Clerks ask, would you like it printed or emailed? Which feels like a referendum on trees and memory. Some receipts arrive as delicate PDFs, tidy as envelopes in a philatelist stream. Restaurant servers carry handheld devices that send the bill skyward to a cloud that floats above the dessert menu. You tap to sign with a finger that is secretly an inkless quill. The signature does not resemble your name, but does resemble your mood. Later, at home, a subject line begins with your order confirmation, which is a phrase that understands human nature. We want confirmation that orders have occurred, that intentions have made it over the counter into the world. Even so, the paper version persists, the retraceable shadow of the transaction. People keep shoeboxes of receipts like gardeners overwintering bulbs. Tax season proves that crumpled documentation reproduces under pressure. You pour them onto a table and find the archaeology of months. A receipt with a coffee ring that tells you where you like to sit. A bookstore receipt that kindly mispronounced the author's name. A hardware store receipt that lists 3 screws and a tape measure and implies a project that went fine. The ritual of smoothing them flat is a kind of meditation. You line them up by date and discover that time forms polite cues fast. Museums collect receipts with a straight face, which is their specialty. There are charge slips from polar expeditions, confirming that even at the ends of the earth, someone balanced a ledger. There are receipts for the purchase of a printing press, which is pleasantly recursive, and stubs for trains to nowhere in particular, which is what most trains technically are. My personal favorite, if I am allowed one, is a Victorian receipt that reads, with admirable restraint, received of Mrs. B. 1 piano, defective. It says everything and demands nothing. Somewhere, a ledger knotted dot the etiquette of receipts is mostly about timing. Hand it to the customer without making eye contact for too long. Fold it around the change so the coins don't feel loose. Offer to place it in the bag as if you were tucking in a small blanket. At restaurants, slide it toward the diner at an angle that indicates neither apology nor triumph. In some countries, you must keep it until the door in case an inspector wishes to witness commerce being properly narrated. People put them carefully in a wallet and forget them instantly. A ceremony that makes amnesia feel organized. There are strange facts. Tiny eyebrow raises spaced evenly like stitches. In some languages, the word for receipt is the same as the word for recipe, and once upon a time they were indeed cousins. Both tell you what went into something, both prove it happened. In other places, the term resembles proof, as if we had been on trial for buying soap. For a while in the 20th century, a few cash registers printed receipts with jokes on the back. Most customers felt gently judged by the humor and declined to laugh. In Japan, some stores heat stamp the receipt with a red seal, a little round sun of acknowledgement. In parts of the world where counterfeit goods are a lively art, receipts are counterfeited too, which is the bureaucracy equivalent of drawing a mustache on a portrait. Receipts have been called ephemeral, which is accurate and slightly rude. They are designed to leave, but while they stay, they do a small, important job. They let two people walk away from a moment with the same story. Price tags argued, barcodes chimed in, taxes made a cameo. Finally, the register printed a line that said total, and everyone agreed to breathe. The receipt is the handshake you can take with you. For returns, it becomes a passport. For budgets, a map. For memory, a flashcard. Years later, a drawer offers up one that reads simply torch batteries. 2. And you recall a storm and a Wednesday, and how quiet the house can be when light works at the speed of a thumb. Some people refuse receipts, and some collect them the way others collect pebbles. The refusal feels streamlined, the collection safe. Both temperaments are fine. Money is a kind of weather, and receipts are the forecast we keep on the fridge. You can fold one into a bookmark, which leads to the curious pleasure of reaching page 80 and discovering you once bought pears. You can write a phone number on one and keep it forever without calling, thus preserving an entire hypothetical conversation. You can draw a map from the station to the cafe and then arrive without unfolding it, a triumph both cartographic and romantic. Receipts are good paper for lists because they've already decided to be useful. Digital wallets now pop up with the gentle enthusiasm of a dog who has heard its name. Receipt saved, they announce, and you feel a tiny portion of the brain relax. There are apps that will take a photo of a receipt, read it like a fortune teller, and file it in a folder named after the tax deduction of its dreams. Spreadsheets enjoy this because spreadsheets are happiest when everything sits still in little squares. Accountants who love calm sleep better in April when receipts have been obedient. The rest of us discover, usually at midnight, a thin triangle of paper folded into the corner of a bag and feel that the universe has just handed us a form of applause. If there is a proper bedtime for receipts, it is the moment they become irrelevant without becoming untrue. After the warranty expires, after the return period yawns and stretches and strolls away, after the numbers have been entered into the right cells, the receipt can retire with honors. Some people shred them, producing confetti that celebrates privacy. Others compost them, returning transactions to the garden, which is philosophical, if not strictly advisable for thermal paper. Many slide them into envelopes and keep them anyway, because certainty is a nice thing to have even when you don't need it. The box on the closet shelf becomes heavier each year, but interestingly, never falls . And so we arrive at the sleepy part, where the day lays itself down in small rectangles. The last purchase murmurs its price and stops arguing. A wallet closes like a book that has finished reading itself. In the kitchen drawer, there is a nest of receipts that has learned each other's edges, the way spoons do. If you smooth one flat with the palm of your hand, it will accept the gesture like a cat that has agreed to be petted. It will tell you the name of a clerk you barely saw, the hour precise as a bell, the address of a shop that is, at this late moment, dark and content. The past few hours settle onto paper and then to quiet. Your eyes grow heavy at the word subtotal because there is always more to add. And tonight you do not have to. Somewhere a register prints the final Z at the end of a shift and feeds out a ribbon that looks like snowfall. A manager counts bills softly, a lullaby of numbers returning to their drawer. A receipt curls in the warmth and becomes a small scroll that no one will read. The light goes off. The door clicks. The receipts breathe out their tiny heat and fall asleep in a language made of dates. If there is a moral, it is printed in faint gray at the bottom. Thank you. The rest is simple. Let the little proofs take care of the day. Let your thoughts file themselves in order, one by one, in rows. And allow the mind to ring up its last item, press the total, and rest, calmly, with no change required. You might not expect a lace ribbon and a calling card to steer the course of romance, but in Victorian parlors they did exactly that, quietly like a small draft moving a heavy curtain. The room sets the tempo first, horsehair sofa, antimacassars lined up like moral commas, a clock that values punctuality more than passion. Voices are subdued because everything seems upholstered, even conversations. A chaperone is present, not to obstruct, but to make the air behave. People sit at a polite distance that could be measured with a ruler kept in the writing desk for just such emergencies. Courtship begins as a list and advances in short appointments. He leaves a visiting card name facing up if he means hello, folded corner if he means hello specifically. She returns books promptly, and the returns are their own dialogue. The parlor's geography does half the work. The sofa's middle cushion is international waters, the nearest lamp a witness. If you're still awake when we reach the part about wedding breakfasts, comprising politely overboiled items, feel free to subscribe. But truly, do not strain yourself. We'll move slowly and hand-stitch steps, like a hen that refuses to hurry. The rules are quiet but thorough. Conversation topics come wrapped in velvet, family, weather, published sermons, and when feeling wild, railway timetables. The dramatic arts are confined to the coal fire, which contributes a crackle at intervals as if signing the minutes. Affection travels in paper notes written in slanted script that never quite says what it says. Nobody uses an exclamation mark. Enthusiasm is expressed with underlining that has lost its nerve. Rumor moves faster than feeling, so etiquette tries to outrun rumor by reducing opportunities for sport. A chaperone is not a guard, exactly. More of a lifeguard who prefers everyone to remain in the shallow end where conversation can stand. The sofa learns a great deal and tells no one. People practice the art of leaving at the correct moment, a skill measured in hat placement and the angle of a bow. Courtship, in this period, resembles a polite committee that meets fortnightly, produces no manifestos, but eventually approves a motion to marry. Carried by a majority of candles, tokens appear like punctuation, small but final. A lock of hair in a locket, the photograph kept in a case that snaps shut with dignity, a ring that knows it is a promise as well as jewelry. Engagements are public in a private sort of way. A notice appears in the local paper with names, 2 families, and a sentence that sounds as though it has been ironed. Everyone who needs to know knows within 3 tea intervals. The trousseau begins as a tidy storm linen labeled with initials too neat to be accidental, nightgowns folded like sighs, sewing that accumulates the way snow does, slowly, entirely, without arguments. Parent committees hold calendars and clergy hold pens, and between them a date is chosen that fits the diaries and offends no saints. Practical concerns carry more authority than superstition. If a Tuesday is convenient and the church is free, Tuesday is suddenly romantic. No one proposes at a dramatic cliff. They propose at a respectable table where the cutlery has been polished into composure. The rhythm never changes. Introduce a detail. Expand it gently, smile at its odd dignity, and continue as though nothing could be urgent. When the conversation shifts to dress, the tone remains unhurried, like silk being shaken out. Before a queen made white persuasive, brides wore their best dress, whatever shade had already proven itself at family dinners. After Victoria wore white, the color gained a pleasant momentum, associating itself with laundry, daylight, and the concept of clean that laundresses understand better than poets. Fabric speaks plainly. Honiton lace if one's connections run toward sentimental geography. Silk satin if the budget allows. Cotton that pretends nothing if the budget does not. A bodice makes its case with seams. A waist remembers the tailor. A train agrees to be modest because the aisle is not a racetrack. Gloves intervene between hands and history. A veil frames the face the way a window frames weather. Footwear compromises with physics. The artistic ideal is a shoe that appears incapable of walking and yet will. Symbols multiply with the politeness of well-behaved guests. Orange blossom suggests fertility with a straight face. Myrtle suggests lasting love without taking credit. A whisper of blue threads a rhyme through the day and refuses to elaborate. Boutonnieres echo bouquets because color enjoys symmetry. Jewelry abides by scale. A family brooch declines to upstage the ring. What might stun a ballroom behaves in a church. There is a charming practicality to accessories. The bouquet is small enough to carry in one hand, because the other hand must greet Aunt Ellen and also hold the handkerchief that keeps weeping ceremonial rather than athletic. If a ring cannot be afforded, a simple band promises to become more elaborate later, the way budgets like to promise. Everything reads like a careful sentence: subject, verb, object, no subclauses, no exclamation points, the meaning clear at a glance. Behind the scenes, fittings are small dramas without villains. The seamstress keeps pins in her mouth like quiet opinions and steps back to see the silhouette make its argument. A cousin fetches ribbon. An aunt says, nearly there, so often it becomes a lullaby. Shoes squeak faintly new leather, learning its lines. Someone insists the groom's waistcoat should be the green that looks black in low light and simply green in stories. A boutonniere is measured against lapel width and personal optimism. Men hire morning coats because owning one would be suspicious. You rent gravity by the day, return it between noon and 3, and receive your deposit back minus the fee for admiration. Ties become cravats and then become polite again. Barbers agree to make hair look as if it has not been made to do anything at all. Everything resolves into a portrait of neatness that feels inevitable and is not. The church provides order the way shelves provide reassurance. The Book of Common Prayer is less a text than a floor plan. Bands are called. Licenses are obtained. A procession takes shape that would amuse a mapmaker. Seating admits only those who are important to the story, or who have insisted that they are. A small choir breathes like an accordion. Organs stop sound like nautical commands. The verger practices the ceremony's punctuation. Stand, kneel, stand, now here. Flowers behave politely around the font. At the appointed moment, a register is opened and opened again, as though a legal flower were blooming. Names are written carefully because the register will live longer than the bouquet. A slow line of signatures creates a minor history. 2 main signatories, a witness who looks heroic by proximity, and a clergyman who writes as if he has signed 1,000 times and still believes in ink. Vows are brief and memorably repeated, which is considerate of nerves. Hands meet in a handshake that has decided to be permanent. Rings complete a circle that has read the manual. The couple do not kiss as theater. They kiss as confirmation. Someone's hat feather trembles like applause. Children count stained glass figures and decide to remember two and forget the rest. The sermon, if present, is tidy, fond of metaphors that prefer ships and gardens to anything complicated. Afterward, there is a modest crush of congratulations, the choreography of gladness, a corridor of relatives, the rustle of silk approving its own existence, the small percussion of shoes finding rhythm on stone dot photography, enters like a guest who arrived late because exposure times were negotiating with daylight. Many wedding portraits are made not on the day, but a day later, when everyone has had time to indent calm. Cartes de visite and cabinet cards turn the event into a pocketable object. Couples pose with a stabilizing rest hidden behind the chair because romance is heavy and chairs are kind. Facial expressions favor the long exposure, no giggles, minimal personality. A serene concentration that says, "We are willing to stand here forever," though forever is estimated at 22 seconds. A bouquet chooses not to wilt on cue. The photographer's studio supplies backgrounds that suggest vague wealth columns, a balustrade, painted foliage that could be either a park or optimism. On the back of the photograph, a caption supplies the facts, date, parish, two names, and a steady hand so that the image does not have to shout. Then comes breakfast, named for the time rather than the ambition. It arrives at noon and behaves as if it were early morning. The menu is respectable and not experimental. Tea stands ready in an attitude of service. Coffee waits, prepared to explain itself. There is wine, there is a cake, and there are portions sensible enough to wear gloves. Toasts are brief and almost apologetic. Speeches rarely attempt comedy. The cake has a better chance at laughter than the uncle does. Gifts are recorded in a notebook because gratitude prefers to be spelled correctly. The couple opens parcels with care that suggests practice, silver spoons, napkin rings that plan to be round for decades, a cruet set that has never asked philosophical questions and never will. Thank you notes hover in the near future like well-behaved rain clouds dot the reception is not a spectacle. The point is to set the household gently on paper and in memory. People sign a guest book as though adding their names to a ledger that measures goodwill. The cake is cut, and everyone agrees that marzipan is a choice and a responsibility. Children are permitted crumbs like small historical concessions. The bride's bouquet behaves itself until called upon to move. Photographers capture a few moments outside if the weather suggests mercy. A doorway framed in ivy, a path that knows it's being watched. Someone remarks on the carriage, even if there will be only a cab, because tradition likes vehicles with opinions. The couple slips away at the correct angle, not hurried, not reluctant like a paragraph ending with a quiet period and a space dot send-off customs lean toward gently cheerful. Confetti appears, sometimes rice, sometimes paper, occasionally flower petals that have completed their real work and enjoy a hobby. A satin shoe is tied to the carriage because symbolism appreciates footwear. Luggage labels invite their ink to become indefinite. Well-wishers write phrases on the backboard of memory. Health, happiness, right. The route to a small hotel or a relative's house doubles as a modest honeymoon. Tickets fold into pockets. Receipts tuck themselves beside them, as receipts like to do. Bells quiet down because bells understand narrative. The day closes its doors with a soft latch dot. The first journey is not adventurous. It is geographic housekeeping. The couple visits family along a string of stations that sound like a poem. A timetable learns two new names. Letters of introduction wait at the first inn because hospitality enjoys paperwork. Trunks sit like patient animals in hallways. The new household, when reached, is a list that has decided to become rooms. There is linen with initials, spoons arranged in drawers like a census, and curtains that are content to keep their opinions about weather to themselves. Everything is future tense in a minor key. The evening ends with the settling of objects into places, and the mind follows suit. Between these scenes, little absurdities keep the story from becoming too crisp. Someone will misplace the ring and find it in a glove. A florist will tie a bow that is just large enough to be polite and just small enough to be intentional. A guest will write their name in the register with a pen that refuses ink for the first half of the surname, creating an aristocrat by accident. Uncles will practice toasts under their breath and then deliver half of them. Children will be drafted as pedal bearers and become enthusiastic about the concept of a straight line. The choir director will count the choir in with a gesture that resembles dusting a shelf. A cousin will bring a camera that behaves like a second cousin. Modern analogies drift in like polite visitors. The seating plan is a spreadsheet wearing a waistcoat. The invitations typography is a well-designed app that does not crash. The gift registry is a crowd-funded sideboard. The breakfast is a launch party with tea. Yet the pace remains slow and textile-based. Even in the present, when photographs are instantaneous and vows are printed from the internet rather than a drawer, the steps still prefer to follow each other calmly, like people leaving a library in good lighting. Victorian weddings, viewed from the hallway of sleep, are less about romance than about format, which is oddly comforting. Format is a blanket. It keeps the wind off the edges. There is space for affection, but the affection wears shoes and uses the doorbell. What is enduring is the persistence of ordinary details, a hat that refuses to sit straight and thus becomes family legend. A handkerchief with a corner stitched by someone who always stitched corners. A program folded into a fan and then kept for years in a drawer with others, a small climate of paper weather. The ceremony is an official conversation between two people in several institutions. Everyone speaks softly and then signs in ink, which is the period at the end of a very tidy sentence. The white dress, once a novelty, becomes a theme that gently refuses to end. It returns in photographs and in stories told 30 years later. Your mother's dress was, and in never quite white shades of laundry day. Flowers have seasonal opinions. Myrtle will do its best, even if the gardener has concerns. Orange blossom will make a brave show that smells like an essay about hope. The veil will become tissue paper in a hat box, its romance fainter but not missing. In the corner of a bureau drawer, a glove waits and becomes a museum of one hand. The vows and the register keep their authority long after the cake has declined. On a random afternoon, the couple may pass the church and remark on the door as if it were a relative. The organist's voluntary, once merely the music that filled the time while people put on coats, becomes the sound of a date on a calendar turning into a room. The photographer's portrait sits on a mantle where it practices the art of occupying a rectangle. On the back, the caption remains unexcited. 2 names, a parish, a date. Future historians read it gratefully, because calm handwriting is an act of mercy. As for the breakfast, it becomes folklore. People remember it was lovely and cannot recall the menu, which is exactly what the menu wanted. Toasts collapse into a 2-sentence anecdote. Thank you notes are written sooner than expected because the couple enjoys finishing lists. Relatives retain a fork each by accident, and those forks migrate into new kitchens and persist for generations, leading a double life as everyday cutlery and faintly ceremonial artifacts. The confetti is swept up but continues to appear glitter-like in the hem of the past. By the time evening arrives, the day has folded itself neatly. The couple is somewhere ordinary, adjusting to a new pronoun. The trousseau sighs, impressed with its own preparedness. A diary receives a few lines that sound as though they were written by a person who has walked home from a library. Nothing dramatic, everything recorded, an awareness that being thorough is its own kind of joy. The parlor where it all began is quiet again. The sofa is relieved. The chaperone has put her gloves in a drawer. Outside, the gas lamps say goodnight to the pavement. Inside, a pair of rings continue not to be surprised. If you have remained awake, you have already behaved more boldly than Victorian romance asked anyone to. You may have noticed that the heart of the whole business is a ledger. Introductions, tokens, flowers, vows, breakfast, journey, each entered, each balanced. There's very little suspense and a reliable amount of cake. It is the sort of history that wears slippers. The details are small and pleased to be small. Even the white dress, famous as it is, prefers to be folded properly. We drift from one scene to the next as the era intended, with the serenity of schedules that like each other. And when the house is dark and the carriage has gone and the parlor clock turns over another hour with its careful pronunciation of time, the day keeps behaving neatly in memory. It doesn't end so much as it tidies itself. Somewhere, a newspaper carries the announcement that everyone already knew. Somewhere else, a bouquet has decided to be pressed between pages. The breakfast dishes are washed, the registers are shelved, and the new couple, having been thoroughly congratulated, learns the quiet pleasure of unpacking. Nothing in particular happens, which is the charm of it. The candles remember what they saw and agree to be ordinary again. Lace rustles itself to sleep, and the story, like a well-mannered letter, ends with a closing that is content to be simple. Ever yours, faithfully, and good night. You might not expect a folded visiting card to choreograph a romance, but in Victorian parlors, a small rectangle of paper could move 2 families, 3 chairs, and the future. The hour is hushed. The clock refuses to improvise. A shawl naps on the arm of a sofa like a hovering chaperone. Candles practice restraint. On the tray by the door, cards rest in tiny drifts, names, addresses, and social weather reports. A gentleman leaves his card with the corner modestly bent to mean called in person, which is the 19th century equivalent of typing your name very carefully and then stepping back from the keyboard. A lady receives it later in a different room, under the careful surveillance of a fern. Courtship is a choreography of tea intervals and doorbells. People speak softly, in complete sentences, as if the wallpaper were taking notes. A chaperone observes from a chair that is both near and not interfering, like good punctuation. Distance between suitor and sofa edge can be measured in inches or in hopes. Either way, it is measured. Eye contact is rationed like sugar. The polite topics arrive on time: weather, books, railway schedules, the new vicar's sermon about patience, which appears to have been written for furniture. If you are still awake by the time we reach the triumph of the wedding breakfast 3rd teapot, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't push yourself. We will get there even if we stop to describe the etiquette of glove removal with needless detail. Engagements begin as information before they become emotion. A newspaper notice appears with the serenity of a timetable. 2 names, 2 families, 1 line. No adjective spill. There's simply the fact of a decision that has been audited by clergy, parents, and the calendar. Tokens are small and portable lockets with hair that continues to behave long after the head has moved on. A ring that sits solemnly like a tiny metal promise. A photograph that opens and closes with a satisfying snap, as if the case were a vault for a face. Letters circulate, folded into shapes that would make geometry feel appreciated. The handwriting leaning forward carefully as if trying not to startle. The trousseau becomes a gentle storm. Linen multiplies with the confidence of a tax table. Embroidery adds initials to everything that holds still long enough. Night dresses learn to fold themselves. There is a drawer for ribbons and a drawer for hopes, and they are not always different drawers. Dates are selected by practical people with ledgers rather than by astrologers with drama. If the church is available, if the baker can be trusted, if Aunt Mercy can secure a decent train time, then Saturday is romantic enough. The sofa remains calmly present while all of this is discussed, holding the weight of the century without, offering an opinion. Clothes take over the conversation the way cats take over chairs, quietly and without apology. Before a certain queen wore a certain white, brides used the best dress they already owned, plum, dove, sea green, whatever had succeeded at being formal before. Then white entered the stage and never entirely left it, varying associations of lingerie, daylight, and an optimism that can be ironed. The fabrics are gently eloquent. Honiton lace speaks with small flowers. Silk satin prefers smooth declarations. Cotton holds its ground with admirable honesty. A fitted bodice makes its case. Seams agree with each other in public. Veils frame faces like windows frame weather. Gloves stand between history and hands and do not take sides. Shoes, practical diplomats, aim to stay quiet while negotiating with cobblestones. Nothing shouts. Everything implies. Floral messages assemble themselves as if the garden were literate. Orange blossom suggests fertility with a straight face. Myrtle, undramatically evergreen, promises duration. Something blue threads a nursery rhyme through the day without needing to explain why nursery rhymes have legal standing. Bouquets are scaled for human arms rather than for architecture. The groom, who knows what side of his lapel is right by instruction, not instinct, wears a boutonniere that agrees with the bouquet and refrains from auditioning for a separate career. Jewelry is polite. Family brooches come out of their tissue hibernation to attend like elderly aunts. Pearls never hurry. The ring enjoys its new importance without smirking. The overall effect is an essay in neatness, with each sentence clear enough to be read from the back pew. Tailors stage their small opera. A morning coat assumes that the day will be respectable. A waistcoat in gentle shades keeps peace between shirt and cravat. Hire shops provide dignity by the day, proof that gravity can be rented and should be returned by 3. Shoes are polished to a reflective humility. Hair is arranged to look as if it arranged itself. At some point, a cousin insists that the color bottle green carries moral weight. No one checks the precedent, but everyone nods gravely. Pocket watches measure the distance between anxiety and punctuality. The mirror offers counsel and accepts no thanks. Church doors transform ordinary street noise into ceremony the way a librarian transforms chatter into reading. The Book of Common Prayer is opened, which is a sacred variation on opening a very important drawer. Bands have been called and licensed things have been licensed, and the procession lines up like a sentence preparing its verbs. Ushered relatives form tributaries that meet at the nave. Music knows what to do, a voluntary that sounds like polished wood, a hymn that sits well on an average voice. Flowers, arranged by someone who understands both symmetry and patience, stand near the font pretending they live there. A registrar's pen waits like a minor character who has the best lines. Vows are plain and therefore weighty. The couple repeats after the officiant in a tone that means both I do and I understand this is serious even though the ring is small. Hands are joined. Rings make their round remark. A kiss occurs with the dignity of a punctuation mark. Hats tilt with relief. The congregation relaxes into smiles that feel like warm porcelain. The order of service becomes a bookmark in the day. What matters next is ink. Names are written in a register as if the paper were a quiet ocean. The letters, little black boats that will still be floating when the bouquet has become memory. Witnesses sign in their best handwriting. Some letters have loops that could be used as handles. A clerk sands the page with a sprinkle of blotting, and history continues to behave. Photography enters late on account of chemistry. On the day itself, light may be insufficient. Rain, which respects no romance but its own, may scribble in the margins. So many couples return to the studio tomorrow, where an obliging backdrop of painted balustrades and improbable shrubbery proffers reputation. A headdress tucked discreetly behind the sitter's collar keeps seriousness from wobbling. Exposure length becomes a moral quality. Smiling is discouraged not because joy is forbidden, but because joy is a blur. The album receives the evidence later, a card mounted on a page with corners that take their duties seriously, names and date written beneath in a hand that leans forward like a person eager to help. Portraits do not capture the sound of organ pipes or the smell of wax, so the caption supplies them quietly. St. Jude's Tuesday, rain. It is enough. Images move through families like polite ghosts and learn the faces of mantelpieces. Then breakfast arrives at an hour that insists on having its own way. It is midday and is still called breakfast, which is the sort of joke a century tells and then forgets to explain. The table possesses a logic, tea as reliable as the post, coffee attempting heroism, wine that behaves as if it has an early appointment. The food is careful, British, and aware of cutlery. The cake is tall because hope is tall. The icing is firm because tradition appreciates structure. Toasts are short, which is merciful, and tender, which is effective. Gifts emerge and are logged. Silver spoons gleam with the confidence of things that know their job. Napkin rings take life seriously. Many of the parcels are mutually reassuring cruets that look like arguments resolved. Decanters that consider dust an adversary they will outlive. A notebook records from whom came what for the making of thank you notes later, so that gratitude can be written in sentences that behave. People drift. Photographers catch a doorway moment. Uncles practice smiling and achieve it twice. Children acquire crumbs that are technically ceremonial. If the weather has conspired to be reasonable, there is a small deluge of confetti, which in some parishes is rice, in others paper, and in a few places flower petals that have already been employed elsewhere and are now freelancing. The couple departs not abruptly, but on a page turn. Luggage has labels that spell names as accurately as registers do. Tickets remember the route better than anyone else does. The vehicle carriage, if you must, cab if you are honest, has something tied to it. Perhaps a shoe that used to belong to a bridesmaid and has now accepted a second career in symbolism. The waving takes precisely the time of a hymn verse. Then the street settles into its ordinary grammar and the day begins to write the past tense. Honeymoon journeys are often rehearsal dinners for geography. The schedule is an itinerary of relatives and scenery, not a sprint for romance. Modest hotels practice discretion because it is their only exercise. Letters of introduction appear at front desks with an air of expectation. Trunks, which have been dignified for weeks, at last acquire the role they rehearsed and stand in corridors like loyal dogs. The first evening in the new household arrives by train and lets itself in quietly. Keys gather on a hook. Linen occupies drawers as if it has paid rent. Spoons arrange themselves with census-like efficiency. Someone marvels at the number of towels that have opinions. A clock is wound and decides to keep the same time as the marriage. Nothing large happens, and that is precisely the point. All around the day, move little absurdities that never get to be dramatic. A ring spends half an hour hidden in a glove because everyone forgot it had no pocket. A batonier falls asleep on a hymn book and has to be woken gently. The pen in the vestry refuses to write for the first half of a surname, turning an ordinary person into a lapsed aristocrat until the clerk fetches fresh ink. A chore boy believes he is a metronome and is not. A cousin's hat refuses to observe the laws of balance and becomes a family anecdote. Everything is correctable, and nothing wants to be urgent dots seen from a modern window. The Victorian wedding reads like a well-managed app where every function is manual. The RSVP is posted with a stamp that has rehearsed the monarch's profile. The seating plan is a spreadsheet copied onto card and copper plate. The playlist is a hymn number list and an organist who accepts requests only if they are already on the page. The registry is a crowd-funded sideboard administered by ants. Photos migrate from albums to frames to shelves and back to albums like Images Conserving Energy. Even now, though the camera speaks faster and the bouquet sometimes behaves like theater, the old rhythm remains. Introduce a detail. Expand it patiently, make a small joke, drift back to the main thread, and continue without hurry. The white dress, which began as a statement, evolves into a habit and then into fabric folklore. People remember it imperfectly but fondly. Cream, no, ivory, perhaps eggshell something fair that became a story. The veil slumbers in a hat box with tissue that crackles like polite thunder. A glove survives in the back of a drawer and sometimes exists only as the fact that it is somewhere. Flowers dry. Petals press themselves between pages and, decades later, release a whisper of scent that suggests a ghost of a Saturday. The register remains. Ink ages but does not resign. A future grandchild traces the letters with a finger and learns the shape of names as if they were small roads dot in the end. The day drifts toward privacy. Doors close. Bells are tired. The parlor is off-duty. Candles go out as if dimming their opinions. The couple unpacks and establishes the Republic of Two. The trousseau enjoys finally being used rather than admired. A diary receives a few lines, probably starting with the weather because many significant days, when explained later, turn out to have been largely meteorological. The photograph is not ready yet. The portrait will appear tomorrow and the tomorrow after that, and for years the mantle will keep quiet company with the frame. If you have traveled this far without sleep, you have been very patient. Victorian time appreciates you. You have heard how a visiting card invited a conversation, how a locket negotiated memory, how white reorganized a wardrobe, how vows preferred clarity to poetry, how a register made permanence look simple, and how breakfast apologized for being called breakfast at noon. Nothing thrilling happened on purpose. The interest lies in the durable smallness of the acts. Folding, signing, fastening, sipping, waving, packing. It is history carried in a gloved hand dot, and so the day keeps on, gently, even when it is over. A pair of rings continue to be accurate, the way a good clock is accurate because it refuses excitement. A newspaper notice sits forever in a bound volume between advertisements for umbrellas and Earnest soap. Confetti works its way into the hem of the pass. The album closes with a muffled satisfaction that makes darkness feel organized. If you are awake, let the details file themselves. If you are asleep, they will manage perfectly well without you. Either way, Lace stops whispering, the clock makes its last soft announcement, and the house becomes very good at being quiet.